Hi everyone, my name is Nick. I'm from a company called Newsworthy Vision here in London. Now, I've done a big long video about all the settings here on the P200 camera, which can increase the professional image produced by your P200s. But I know most of you don't want to sit through a half an hour to 40-minute video going through what all the settings are. You just want to know what they are. So, here is what I recommend for your basic settings to get started. Set your gain to 0. Set your gain limit to 10.7 dB, so it cannot ever go above 10.7. Set your shutter speed to the same frame rate as your project. That is 50 if you're in Europe and 60 if you're in North America and Japan. Okay? And of course, it's also 50 in Australia and Russia and most of Europe, and look up your local settings. Okay, it's based on the electricity grid. If your electricity grid is 110 volts, you're a 60 hertz zone. If your electricity grid is in between 220 and 240 or 250, you are in a PAL 50 hertz zone. It's still a throwback to the old PAL NTSC era, which we moved on from. Your iris is optional to you. If you want something a bit more bright, I would bump that up to as wide open as possible and use that to control the amount of light coming into the camera. Generally stay away from each end. Meaning, don't be constantly operating at f14 and don't be constantly operating at f.6. Because you will find at the fringes, at the top and the bottom, you will always have a slight bit of issues. So try to stick in the middle ground between 5.6 and 4 and you should be fine. And of course, all of these settings are in manual mode, which is in the first page of your menu settings. Okay, so stick with manual mode. I highly recommend it. White balance, one push white. Okay, if you've got one push white mode and a keyboard, use the one push white balance button to do that. Otherwise, if you don't have access to one push white, then I would highly recommend running all the cameras on either the same outdoor mode or the same indoor mode. So if you're, where I am now, I'm under 4 daylight lights in a studio, I would want outdoor mode because that is what daylight light is. If you're under tungsten lights, generally it's places like theaters, or conference venues quite often may have different lighting, like fluoro lights or tungsten lights. Go through the outdoor and indoor settings, see which looks best for you, but make sure all the cameras share the same preset if you're not able to one push white balance them manually. Okay, going on to picture 1, I would run, me personally, sharpness 5. Sharpness 5 for a lot of detail. The effect is off because you don't want black and white. Noise reduction at 2. You don't want too much because things start to get smeared, particularly on faces, and you don't want too little because, in all fairness, these cameras are a little bit noisy in dark areas. Be aware of that. Wide dynamic range, switch it off. Don't use it. I don't quite know what it does yet. Me personally, would not use it. Color matrix, stay away from it. There's a lot of settings there that you can mess up and your image may not be able to recover from it, and it'll be really, really hard to do that quickly if you're in a panic situation. And contrast, leave it at 128. It seems acceptable enough, but if you wanted, you could increase it a bit just to create a bit more range between your bright areas and your darker areas. Infrared cut filter on page 2. Not really a necessary need for it unless it's a creative need, or if you need like surveillance footage using one of these cameras. Though if you need surveillance footage, why wouldn't you buy a surveillance camera? These are not surveillance cameras, these are broadcast cameras. Chroma suppression, leave it off, don't know what it does. Hlc mode, also leave it off, don't know what it does. Backlight compensation, if you're shooting towards something that has so much backlight behind them, don't shoot towards something with so much backlight behind them. Change the scene. You have that power. You can move somebody and say, you really shouldn't be standing in front of that sunlit window because it's too bright for the cameras to handle. Generally leave it off. If you're desperate and you absolutely have to do it where you have to do it, yeah, fine, use it. Stabilizer, off. Too much processing power by the camera to do other things, so leave it off unless you absolutely have to use it. Gamma, leave it on 0. The one setting at the moment I haven't found a good use for, leave it on 0, and that should be fine. Now, if you really want to stick around, find out what all these options do in great detail, hang about. Thank you very much for joining me today. I am probably like most of you, and I raced and bought one of these P200 kits from BirdDog that comes with the keyboard and the 3 cameras. And I'm actually really, really enjoying it. I'm enjoying using the system. I really, really like it, and it's definitely got a lot of potential. I just wanted to take you through a couple of setting ideas that I had because I've been a broadcasting cameraman for the last 20 years, and I've definitely got a few preferred settings that whenever I pick up any camera, the first things I look for is what I can do with the white balance, what I can do with the iris, what I can do with the shutter, and what I can do with the gain, which are some of the most important settings you'll find with any camera when you're using them, because they greatly affect your image in very different ways, but they definitely contribute to putting together a decent image. So I've taken advantage of the fact that I'm within the studio today, and this is not my normal workspace, so hence why I am masked up and I'm by myself in this environment, so there's absolutely no one else in here. I'm being as safe as we possibly can. Now, these three cameras are set up on the table here in front of me. You can see here's camera 1, camera 2, and camera 3. And here's, of course, the little keyboard which comes with the kit. Now, what I'm doing here today is I'm showing you how the camera looks out of the box, which is an example of camera 1 here. Camera 1 has been factory reset back to the default settings. So this is full auto, with everything as is, and it's actually looking pretty good. I wouldn't be too, upset with this sort of an image straight out of the box. But you can tweak it. You can actually change some settings. You can actually make things look as good as possible. I've done that a little bit with camera 3 here, and I'll just switch over to that now. As you can see, camera 3 looks slightly better. It's got a better white balance. It certainly looks more colorful. And I think with the exception of this light above me, which although it looks like it's daylight, is not actually properly daylight, I don't think. I think there is a tinge of tungsten in there, despite the fact I have set it up what I think should be daylight. And that's something with the white balance in here, is I am under lighting that should be 5600 Kelvin, which is standard daylight. However, obviously things can shift over time, so it may not be exactly right. But most people wouldn't light this way, especially indoors, because the rule always used to be is if you're at nighttime or if you're indoors, you go tungsten lighting, which is 3200 Kelvin, just because that's a standard. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to go through some of the really basic settings that you can find on the menu within the BirdDog itself, which is the internal menu. So what I highly recommend is that rather than using the web GUI to start with, is you actually plug in a HDMI monitor or an SDI monitor into your camera, and you use the manual menu settings, because they seem to be the most responsive and the ones that cause most changes to happen immediately and in a guaranteed fashion. I'm finding with the web GUI that you are updating some settings and it will take a minute or two, or not a minute or two, I'm sorry, that's a lie, take a second or two to update, but then when it does, obviously it all kicks in. Sometimes though, with the web GUI, I found that it will actually just suddenly decide, oh, that page isn't available anymore, and it will just drop, and then suddenly the page will come back. But the setting you try to change may or may not have taken. So, take this with a grain of salt, but be aware that the best way I've found to change the settings on your camera is within the internal menu, which you can only see if you have a monitor plugged in directly into the back of the camera or via NDI into your laptop like I'm doing right now. Now I am using the latest beta firmware for this, which is dated the 20th of the 12th, 2020. So the firmware is BirdDog P200 A2_A3 20.12.3380. So if you want to go along with me, you can actually make sure you're running the same firmware. So we have our three cameras all set up. The first two, cameras 1 and 2, are set up, as I said, with the factory reset in mind. We're going to use this as our point of comparison a little bit later. So camera 1 will remain as factory reset. Camera 2, we're going to tweak. And camera 3, we are going to leave as it is. This is sort of my favorite image quality, if you like. Now, actually, there's a point I just remembered, is that this microphone that I'm wearing right now, and I probably just really messed up the audio on, this microphone is actually plugged directly into the BirdDog. So this is a working 3.5mm jack microphone, which I found on amazon.co.uk for all of 20 quid. I will put the details for that microphone I bought at the bottom of this video, so you know which one to get, because I went through a couple of microphones that did not work. Because quite often is the case, you need power. So with this particular microphone, it actually has battery operated power within it, so it powers itself. Quite often it's called phantom power, but it's obviously not as strong as phantom power, but it's enough to get it into the BirdDog, because the BirdDog microphone jack does not provide power. Not enough for a microphone anyway. So, moving on from that, let's take a look at the camera 2. We're going to go through all the menu settings one by one, so we can decide what looks best, and then of course you can decide what you want to do. But I'm going to give you what I think are my ideal settings, in order to get around some things with these cameras, including noise in the darker areas, and also things like gain and grain and anything generally ugly with these things. We're going to try and iron those out today. So let's switch over to camera 2, which I have done now. As you can see, I have full control here with my keyboard. I'm going to bring up the menu as such, so we can actually go through the settings one by one, and we can start to make some adjustments. Now, it is currently in full auto mode, so just be aware of that as we go through things. So I've got to try and align myself. There we go. So that you can actually see me behind the menu there. I think it's important to actually see what it is you're changing as it's changing. That way you can know whether you're doing the right thing or not. So let's go through exposure, the first menu that appears here, right? So currently in full auto mode. Me personally, as a camera operator, there's only one option that I consider with this, and that is manual, which is literally I am in control of every setting and I determine what goes on and when with the gain, with the iris, and with the shutter speed. Because frankly, handing over those things to a computer, whilst it's a good idea if you're in a really fast-paced environment, it will not choose the prettiest options first. It will always try and add more gain, it will always try and slow down the shutter speed in order to increase the amount of light reaching the sensor of the camera. Now, you don't want that. You don't want your shutter speed to go down below what your frame rate of your project is, because then you start to get really slow ghosting sort of movement, and there's nothing really pretty about that. But it's a very last resort option when you need to get more light onto your sensor. Then, of course, gain. Gain is great. It can be useful, but quite often unnecessary, because if you find you're having to add gain to your image, then I dare say you've actually probably not got enough light. So first of all, if you need more light, try and add more light first, okay, before you start doing it artificially. These should be last resort options, and I found, especially when being in dark environments, they should be used very sparingly, because gain noise is quite ugly. And let's take a look at that now. But we'll go through the other options first, okay? So there's full auto, which obviously it does everything, but you can turn off slow shutter, which is the one that I was talking about. Okay, so slow shutter is when it will dip below what the frame rate of your project is. So if we turn that on, we put our limit, see, it'll basically, with this setting, it will go down to 1 frame per second. So basically you'll move like this, anything with a little bit of action will just be useless, and your broadcast will look really, really weird. So slow shutter, I don't think for any sort of broadcast project is actually anything useful, unless you want to be really artistic and creative, which generally I'm not. AE response, that's a very good, I don't quite know that one. That's one that's new to me. I imagine that's probably the response time. In fact, that's what I'm going to bet it is it's the response time of the camera to realize, oh hey, I need to change this setting. How quickly do you want me to do that? Do you want me to snap within a frame to make that happen, or do you want me to sort of gradually bring in a change over, say, a second? So if they want to add more gain, then it will gradually do that over a long period of time, or it'll just snap it straight in order to make it work. I would go with something a little bit like around about a second or so. So I'm not quite sure what units of measurement that's using there, but I'm going to bet 48 to 1, I don't quite know. You'd best ask support if you want with that. Gain limit is how much you want the gain to actually go to. Okay, so 28.6, that's excessive. And the lowest setting is 10. If it were me, I would set it to 10, because you really don't want it going any larger than that, because anything above that is ugly, like really, really quite ugly. So we can go back up to our modes here at the top. Turn off slow shutter first of all. Next mode is manual mode. Now that'll be the one I'll deal with last. So iris priority. This is where you want to set the iris to be a strict setting, and you don't want that to change at all, because when, as I was mentioned before, the camera wants to put more light on the sensor, it will choose one of 3 things. It will choose to open the iris, introduce gain, or slow down the shutter. Okay? So when you're in iris priority mode, it will take out the iris as an option with that. So it will not change the iris setting no matter what happens. It will only increase the gain and slow down the shutter speed in order to bring in more light. So with this, the reason you would want to do this is if you want to maintain a certain look, because having your iris wide open when you're doing items tends to look a bit more cinematic on larger sensor cameras. On these smaller sensor cameras in the BirdDog P200s, not really something you're going to get away with. really cinematic sort of soft background looks. And if that's something you're looking for, then this is not the camera for you. This is not something that is going to produce cinema quality video. Okay, it's going to produce good video, but only if you get the settings right. However, having said that, having the iris wide open does at least allow you to have things with a bit more depth of field than normal, even a small sensor camera like these. So we'll set our iris to as open as possible. Whoops, one too far, which is 1.6, which for a camera is quite good. That is quite a good fast aperture. So we'll set it to that. And then you've got a gain limit here, right? Now you want to set that to as low as possible so that you don't introduce too much gain into your picture. So 10.7 is what I would go with there. Exposure compensation, you can tweak that, but oh God, have I crashed it? I think I have. Wait. Okay, so that's not good, BirdDog. What's happened there? All right, so I've gone to the exposure compensation menu and it's not liking it anymore. I may well have just killed that camera. Huh. That's not good. Not good at all. Resync. Okay. So, interestingly, I just discovered a bug there with the menu system here, and it caused my video to crash, in fact, and it stopped recording and lost control of the camera for a minute or two. So, for some reason turning on exposure compensation here has absolutely killed any control I have over this camera. I don't know why, but I now can't get out of this menu. So, BirdDog John, I'm going to be coming for you with this. All right? I cannot switch off this option now. You can see here, trying to get out here, pressing menu, nothing is happening. Absolutely nothing is happening. So, not sure what's happening there. Switch to a different camera. Camera 2. Oh, could this be? This could in fact be a keyboard issue. Oh. Oh, okay, things are happening. Things are happening. Okay, right. I think this is a keyboard issue. Because what I just discovered then is by going through... Oh, it's happened again. Okay, John, there's an issue here with this firmware. Maybe it's with the keyboard, I'm not sure. But it seems to be when I then go into... Here it is. Ha! Yes, see, I'm now using the NDI Studio Monitor to actually get out of that. And that seemed to save me there. So, see if I can do that again. Oh, forgive me. So, off. Great, good. I've turned that off. So, this is not something I would recommend. It's not a mode I would recommend for any sort of broadcast anyway, because why would you want to use iris priority? It seems to be slightly unnecessary. Just move that over a bit. So that I would stick with like a shutter priority. And I am here in Europe. It's Britain, but I still call it Europe because it will forever be Europe, and that's my opinion. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. And we work in 50 frames per second here, and I generally do any of my productions in 50 frames per second. So my shutter speed will always be 1/50th of a second, because that matches the frame rate, and that's just how it should be. So if you're going to use a mode where you wanted everything to be automatic, stick with shutter priority, okay? And if we set that to 1/50th of a second with the lowest gain limit possible, then that would be a nice and simple way to get you through. It would automatically control the iris, it would automatically control the gain, and keeping it as low as possible. Let's stay away from exposure compensation since we're having a bit of a problem with that. So now in shutter priority, because it's now going to use the iris and the gain to now increase the picture if you go in something dark. So you can see there's a big bookcase behind me. I'm going to go in there and we're going to see if we can trigger that iris going in, and I seem to have lost. Oh, no, there we go. In fact, that actually proved it, didn't it? Now that's that's interesting. Ah, okay. Yeah. Oh, I see what's going on here. I was screwing around with buttons too much, so I've actually wrecked the zoom on it. So we go up a little bit. When I zoom in here, in shutter priority mode, as you can already see, when I start panning towards a darker area, look at my face. Right? Come back to me where the brightest part of the image is down the center. You can see the iris physically close down as it goes past, because that's the iris of the camera going, oh, that's suddenly too bright. I need to compensate for that. So when I pan over to a darker area, everything suddenly gets a little bit brighter. And things that are already bright are now way too bright. So this is why I do not like automatic modes, because it decides for you what it's going to be. Okay. Now, when you're in fully manual mode, you've got to be able to change things quickly. You've got to be able to adjust settings quickly. You've got to be able to stay across what your image is looking like so that you can adjust it on the fly, right? Which is difficult with the BirdDogs. It's not easy, and the keyboard makes it easier, but it's still not easy to be able to tweak the iris, to be able to tweak the gain, to be able to tweak the shutter. There's a few things that do need to change on this, and I'm trying to develop some software at the moment using the API to do that, but unfortunately we are hitting a snag with that. Because what I would love to be able to see on this keyboard, on this panel, is what the iris is doing at this exact moment, what the gain is doing at this exact moment, and what the shutter is doing at this exact moment, and I want to be able to tweak them, turning these dials to be able to say, set this to this, this to this, this to this, and do not change it unless I actively change this dial. That's what I want. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but maybe hopefully they'll listen to me one day. Right, so we're still here on camera 2. We'll bring back the menu now. So I'm going to show you why working in manual mode is most ideal for these sorts of things. So we can see our settings here with manual mode. Just move myself a little bit to the side there. Zero gain, we don't need it. I'm in a very well lit studio that's actually got 4 big bright daylight lights around me. We don't need to have any gain in the image. There's plenty of light here. So we set our gain limit to 10.7 just in case you accidentally tweak the gain switch. It's not going to suddenly bring in 50 dB of gain. dB being the system, forgive me, what's it called? The unit measurement of the amount of digital noise, or digital amplification of light that you're bringing onto the camera sensor. Okay, so keep that low, keep your shutter speed matching the frame rate of your project. If you're shooting a 25 frame project here in Europe, then keep it at 25. If you're shooting a 50 frame per second project here in Europe, keep it at 50. If you're shooting in the United States, Canada, Japan, or any other weird country that decided to go with 110 volts for their electrical systems back in the early 1900s rather than 240 like the majority of the rest of the world, then you'll want either 29.97, 30, or 60. Okay, now because I have a 50 frame per second setting on the camera as my output, it will only let me do it in multiples of 50 or 25, like so. Okay, shutter speed is important for action. If you're using these cameras for something like sport, or something that's, you know, a bit more energetic, dancing, or something that's got a lot of movement to it, then feel free to up the shutter speed. Feel free to have the shutter speed above your frame rate, but never take it below. Because yes, as you can see there, whilst it does give you a lot more light on your sensor, look what it does to even the slightest bit of movement. It causes very, very strange, sort of almost like a ghosting effect going on, right? And as you take that down further, you'll see the movement gets more pronounced. But the amount of light now reaching your sensor goes up a lot, okay? So if you're seeing an action like this, you're seeing your images are looking very strange, and we'll compare cameras 2 and 3 here, where I'm making the exact same movement. You can see in 1, it looks quite normal, but on camera 2, it looks very strange. This is why. It's because your shutter speed has gone down below your current project frame rate. Okay, so let's knock that back up to 50. Iris, we are in a darkened room, but there's quite a lot of light here, so I mean, I can put that, I can put that up to 1.6, the most open the iris can be, and that looks quite good. That looks good to me. My shirt is quite a bright white, so I would say probably knock that down a peg, because your aim here, I keep hitting the wrong way, your aim here is to, with video, you want your white to be where white is, and you want the blacks of the image to be where black is, right? So you want things that are black to be black, things that are white to be white, and not generally anything above or below that, okay? What we can see in this image here is that I'm wearing a relatively whitey grey shirt, but where's the detail? It's basically gone, okay? Because it's so bright there under these lights. There's too much light. We actually need to take that down a peg more. So let's knock that down to 2.8. But now conversely, my skin tone has gone down. It still looks okay. I mean, in a pinch, let me just take a menu for a second, look at the camera. I would accept it. Not great. I would probably knock that up back one more pinch with the iris, only because it just looks a little bit dark. So what I would say then is that the ability of these cameras to determine the difference between things that are incredibly bright and things that are not, as soon as it reaches a point on the video scale, it just goes, nah, I'm just going to make that flat with no detail. Because if you look on camera 3 here, you'll actually see, so I'm not trying to flex here, I promise, there's quite a lot of detail in this shirt, okay, as you can see, but it's not getting picked up on camera 2 because the shirt is so bright, it just flattens it, gets rid of any detail on the shirt whatsoever, and is not very pleasant. It just looks milky and flat and awful. But you've got to find a compromise between exposing for the face and exposing for the shirt. Generally, the face should always be the one because that's what people are looking at. Now, where should you expose for with the face, right? You don't want that to be the brightest thing in the image because it's not, right? Doesn't matter what skin tone it is you're dealing with. You always want to have generally something white in the image and set your iris based on that. Like my shirt here, for example, it is, you know, slightly overexposed, but it's still in the realms of acceptability. So this seems like it'd be a pretty good spot to do that. Now, if I had a proper color chart here, it'd actually show you, and even if I could bring in some sort of waveform monitor to show where light levels should be, don't have that with me today. Maybe I'll do a future video about that. But generally keep your iris open to make sure that your whites aren't too white and that your blacks aren't too above black, okay? But we can have a look at another setting later that might help with that. High sensitivity, let's have a look at what that does. Switch that on. I don't really notice much difference, to be honest. Looking at that, I would say that is a setting not entirely necessary. I'm not even sure what it's doing right now. High sensitivity, I imagine that would mean it's probably doing something. I can't see a major difference there. So feel free to ignore that setting. That's what I would say to you there. Now we come over to white balance. Here is probably one of the most important things that you'll ever do with these cameras, because when you are using auto mode, like we're seeing right here, okay, with white balance auto, yep, right there, what it does, it will just look at the image and go, oh, let's find a generally, you know, a spot that is average across the board there, and I'll just set it to that. That's fine. So what we'll do is we're under daylight light here. I'm going to take it out of the menu here briefly, pan up, you can see there's a daylight light up there, right? So the camera's going, oh yeah, that's probably about daylight, that's fine. But if you came down and you went to an area that was not under that light, let's say for example, the keyboard laptop, which is somewhat obscured, okay? Take a quick look there, forgive me, well out of focus. That's embarrassing, yikes. Right, okay, so that's there. Not seeing too much difference there, but if I zoom out, you can see the camera straight away is going, oh, okay, I'm detecting quite a bit of difference here. Essentially what I'm trying to tell you here, and I'm not demonstrating it very well, is that if you have it on auto, the camera is just going to randomly decide based on what it sees in the image as what it should be set to, okay? Which is not ideal, because if you're doing a show with quite a bit of movement and quite a bit of activity, you may have something suddenly come into your broadcast that is not the same color as everything else, that is not the same, under the same light as everything else. So what you'll find is your white balance will shift without warning, and it will just happen without you having any impact on it. So for me, personally, stay away from white balance auto. Good idea if you just want a quick show, but if you're doing something where you're having to move the camera quite a bit around different environments, stay away from it. Indoor, this is what it thinks tungsten is, okay? This, as you can see, I'm under the daylight lights here, but the camera is going, oh, well, you must be under tungsten lights. So I'm just going to set my white balance to tungsten. But I look crazily blue, quite icy. That is because it is at entirely different color temperature. So the camera is working around 3.2, the lighting in here is at 5.6. So indoor is not always indoor. be aware of what your lighting is. It's presuming your indoor lighting is going to be tungsten, but in this case it's not. So if it looks a bit weird, don't stick with indoor. Outdoor. Now, as I explained earlier, daylight light is outdoor light. Allegedly, 5.6 for 5600 Kelvin is the average outdoor daylight light produced by the sun with our blue sky to create this look. And these lights are designed to do that. So this looks more than acceptable. I would be quite happy with this. And if you leave it on outdoor, that means when you move the shot around in this lighting, it is not going to change the white balance. So I would accept using indoor and outdoor if the colors were right, because then once you set it, it's not going to change. So for broadcast cameras, like your news cameras that I'm used to, this would be like as if you were setting to your preset 5.6 or 3.2 with indoor or outdoor. Moving on, next mode, OPW. What is OPW? It stands for one push white balance. So if you are the owner of one of the nice P200 keyboards like this one, it has a button. It says one push white balance over here on the left side. Now, what this is about, and it's my favorite mode, because you are basically saying, I don't care what your presets are, I want to decide what the white balance is going to be. So what you do in this case, and I'm going to have to get out of the menu for this, let's come back to outdoor, sorry about that, is what this does, you are manually telling the camera what you want the white balance to be. So we're going to move this down here to my lovely white clean shirt, which, and that's an effect that we just noticed that I'm going to go through later. You go into an area of your scene that is somewhat white, this shirt will do, and then you press the one push white balance button. Now, what you just noticed there is it's just added quite a bit of magenta to the shots because this white balance, forgive me, the white on this shirt looked a bit different to what the camera was set to. So if I pull out now, return that, back to where we were, that looks a lot better. I'm happy with that. So that's a much more pleasing image, okay? So if we get back to our menu here, back down to white balance. So we have, just looking at my facial colors here, there's one push white balance versus outdoor. The outdoor one is a bit greener and a bit more yellow. So if we switch back here to 1PW, it's added quite a bit of magenta there, and that looks a lot better to me. So for me, as a broadcaster, I would always use one push white balance, and I would get all of your cameras to white balance on the same object at the same time under the same light so that everything should be in sync. If you're doing a multiple camera thing and you're switching between them, this is critical because otherwise you might have a blue camera versus a green camera versus a red camera. Okay? So if you're doing multi-camera, use indoor, outdoor, or 1PW. Never use auto because every camera might be looking at a different thing. Okay. Well, laptop's really kicking off now. Having 3 NDI recordings running at the same time must be really pushing it. We now, back into white balance, beyond one push white is auto trace white, ATW. What this does, this is a lot like auto, but it will constantly be trying to update the white balance. So if I move, I'm going to leave that on ATW while I go back to camera control. If I bring this down here now, quite a white object there. You'll notice that my skin tone there on my right hand, a little bit pinker on the fingertips, so it's added some magenta as I tilted that down. I come back up. You can see, if you look at my face in particular, I just noticed, you look closely for this, right? It's added quite a bit of green and yellow because of that yellow light behind me. But when I tilt down, you'll actually see my face went a bit red there. Okay, if I do a really, really slow tilt, because you're getting rid of the items that are in the shot that are causing it to go yellowy green, which is that light up behind me, which I don't think is really daylight anymore. So that's causing a problem. So auto trace will go, okay, I can see there's more yellow green in the picture, I'm going to try and adjust for that. Stay away from auto trace, particularly if you're doing a multiple camera production. Oops, sorry, I'm just tweaking that camera around a bit too much. So back into our menus, white balance, auto trace, stay away from it. And you've got user mode. This is complicated. Now, this is you adding your own red and blue tint to the image. So you'll notice if you go to red gain, you're basically telling the camera, I want you to add more red. Okay, if we press right there, and as you can see, my face is getting redder and redder like Dr. Zoidberg. Not really a good look. So it doesn't take much to drastically change the shot. As you can see, I've only gone down about 15 steps, and already it's gone from a heavily cooked lobster to a somewhat yellowy green alien. So for me personally, like, despite the fact that I could make this work, why would you want to? Why would you want to do the job of a CCU operator and try and constantly tweak the colors of the image when you can just reliably white balance it and stick with that, okay? If you had more crew than just yourself plus one other, say for example, then yeah, sure, look at it, but put this at the bottom of your priority list because frankly, you shouldn't need to be doing this while you're producing. Now you've got outdoor auto, which means it's going to have a base of 5600 to start from, but then it's going to automatically try and tweak from that. So again, not one I'd stick with because yeah, look, it's gone very yellowy green again. SVL auto, sodium vapor lamps. These are the lamps you'll find generally outdoors at night time on streets in the old days when they were the big old orange lights. Very rarely we'd be shooting under them. So this is a setting, pardon me. So this is a setting I don't think, forgive me, hiccups, didn't mean to do that. God. This is a setting I don't think you'll need. You got SVL, that's very tungsten. So this is just like the indoor and outdoor settings earlier, but only if you're underneath those gigantic sodium vapor lights that you find on streets or in stadiums. So could work, and it would be a nice place to start from as a flat base to keep all your cameras looking the same. SVL outdoor auto, same deal, but instead of using the sodium vapor lamp in tungsten, it's using daylight, which is why it now looks a lot more acceptable. And then we're back to auto. So that's white balance done. So we're going to put that back on one push because that was by far the most pleasing result, in my opinion. Right, now we get into the complicated area of the picture settings. And we're going to go through picture 1 and 2. We're going to delve into some aspects, but we're not going to go into everything because 1, I don't have all the time in the world, and 2, because there is a lot, and I mean a lot to go through. So, picture 1, sharpness. Now, if you have a look at the image already, it's already pretty sharp, okay? Like, I'm not too dissatisfied with the image as it is. So, I'll be honest, I would probably either get rid of that or leave it alone. You could put it up a little bit if you wanted a bit more detail, but as you add sharpness, what you then add to the image is noise, because it's got to try and create that detail from somewhere. So that's when you have noise reduction as your next thing to play with, which is on this same menu. Apologies, I just realized I'm using the wrong camera. There we go. So as we increase the sharpness, your noise will also increase. So me personally, I wouldn't go back. So as you increase the sharpness, you will also increase the amount of noise generated in your picture, okay? So me personally, go with a sharpness level of about 5. If you're in a well-lit place and you want to try and bring out the wrinkles in my forehead like we've got here, or, you know, just details in the face, or even on my shirt, you can now start to see in the slightly darker areas, there's a bit more detail in the shirt there. Okay, so go with a sharpness of 5. So effect, this is for black and white. If you want to do a black and white broadcast, I can't understand why you would. It's ridiculous. Come on, what are we? Go back in time? No thanks. So we'll turn that off. Noise reduction. Any noise in my world is bad noise. So if we can reduce that, great. However, when you up your noise reduction, right, what tends to happen is the camera is now having to process the image a lot more. So you'll quite often get a bit more ghosting if there's a lot more activity. So if you're doing sport or something similar, you may start to see a bit of slowdown of your movement as if the shutter speed had been lowered. That's because it's having to process so much more. So me personally, for a pure image, turn off noise reduction. And the image doesn't look that noisy, I don't think. I'm just going to double click that. I mean, there is a bit of noise there that I can see, particularly on the side of my face. So if, oh, actually that was with noise reduction 5, so that's my mistake. So what I would say with noise reduction off, I'm looking here, sorry, mirror image, around the side of my face. And one thing, I'm going to take back what I said about the sharpness. I would like that drop down a bit, okay? And please forgive the COVID hair, COVID eyebrows, everything needs a cut, and I'm sorry. So I would put myself sharpness to 2, looking at the full screen image here, and the noise reduction, there we are. So there is a good happy medium. If you look around my left temple, sorry, no, it's actually my right temple, there's a bit of noise there, okay? Which, not ideal, but this is a tricky one. This is where it's up to you, all right? Me personally, this would be more than acceptable. Okay, so I would have noise reduction on 2, sharpness 2, noise reduction 2. Let's go with that. Okay, flip and mirror, pretty obvious. Okay, flip is flipping vertically and horizontally. Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, and mirror is just flipping horizontally. So you shouldn't really ever need to do this, but if you do and suddenly you realize why your image is upside down and on the wrong side, this is why, because you've got the flip and mirror settings on. Okay, flip is great if you want to mount the camera upside down, and then you may need a mirror as well, but of course your circumstances may vary depending on what you're doing. Now here is a setting called wide dynamic range, WDR. This is something you will find in much larger sensor cameras, 35mm guys like your Sonys, like your Alexas and your Red cameras, because when they're recording, they record in a RAW format that so much more information, particularly for editing and for coloring later on down the track for major feature films and the like. But do you need it for this? I say no. This is something that's nice to have, and if you're in a dark environment like this, it can add in a huge amount of light instantly. Okay, so it's a way to definitely make your picture brighter if you've pushed your iris, your gain and everything as high as you can go. But look around this image now, particularly look in the darker areas over here. Look at all this noise. This is ugly. I don't like this. It's a way to bring out features in areas that don't have much light, like the bookcase behind me and the area over there, but I personally wouldn't bother. I've got a well-lit subject here in front of me, you know, just leave it as that. And if you want to have a brighter background, put some light on it, okay? Don't be lazy. I've been lazy here, so I'm in no position. Color matrix. Again, I don't really want to be screwing around with this. I've got other things to do. So this is great to have if you really want to tweak something to make it look particularly good. But for me personally, handy to have, but not something I'm going to be using very often. And contrast. So this is telling the camera how you want the difference between things that are bright and things that are dark. So I'm just pushing this up now, and it's actually really frustrating with this keyboard. I can't hold this down for the setting to go up. It's just going up one at a time, and I have to beat the handle to make that go. I can show you on the other camera what I mean. Number 2. Oh, yep, that's why. So when it's on that mode, what I'm finding is that, watch this, I have to, like, one by one. I can't just hold that down and have that go up. It just sits there. But back to the point at hand. Increasing the contrast makes the image look a bit more interesting, dynamic in some cases. But for me personally, again, not really something I would use. So I personally would leave this alone. It was set to 128, and look how long it took me to actually set that to 170, 180. So this can crush, we call it crushing the blacks and crushing the whites. So if you have a really bright thing in the picture, this will attempt to make it a bit more compressed. And if you have something black in the picture, it will also try and compress the blacks to bring down that level. This is something I'm not going to use too much. So that's the end of picture 1. Picture 2. Now we have a bit more featurey sort of stuff. So we have here the infrared cut filter. If you're doing like some sort of surveillance-y sort of thing in a really dark environment like this, sounds like it'd be a cool thing to have. Let's see what it does. Switch that on. Anything that's dark now looks quite dark. Anything that is not dark, you know, now looks quite bright. So it has that nighttime security effect look, which is quite cool, particularly with the PTZ camera. So if you're moving it around, it could look very much like a surveillance camera effect, if that's something you're going for with your production. But also, if you're wondering why your image is black and white and you can't work out why, check the black and white setting that we saw earlier, and then check this one, the IR cut filter. Because chances are that's what's on. Switch that off. Chroma Suppress. I'm going to guess from the name of it that this is designed to make sure that your colors do not go beyond where they should in the video world, because there's a thing, I think it's called a vector graph. Yeah, I could be completely wrong here because it's been a long time since I've used one, which has all of the primary colors on a circle. And the idea is you're not supposed to have the colors go beyond this in terms of brightness. Chroma Suppression, I imagine, would try to do that. It would go, okay, I've got a lot of yellow here, but it shouldn't be beyond this mode. I'm going to try and bring back the yellow a bit. So it could be like having an automatic hue and gain on certain colors. Not sure, but let's see what happens. I'm going Chroma Suppression low, mid, high. I don't really see too many changes there. All right, but I'm finding with these cameras, the least amount of processing settings you can have running, the better. The camera will be far more responsive and have far less latency. Hlc mode, let's switch that on, see what that does. Not sure what that does. I'm sure John from support could tell us. Switch that off. Backlight compensation is on. That shouldn't be on. That should definitely be off. If you're in a room that has a lot of light behind you, which is not a room that I'm in right now, actually looking on camera 1, actually, there's quite a bit of light there. I'm going to switch over to that. Okay, and let's see if having that backlight function does anything for that giant backlight, which is right there behind me. As you can see, well, you see, look what it's doing to my hand. It's smearing that light there. So let's turn on backlight compensation. Whoa, hello, look at that. So what that's designed to do, guessing from this, is it detects when there's any sort of big bright light behind you, and it attempts to bring up the light of your foreground in order to match that. I really don't like that. I'm not happy with that. However, keep in mind, this camera is set to factory defaults, okay? So just switch that off. When it's set on factory defaults, it's going to try and open everything up in order to make it work. Another good reason to stay away from factory defaults, folks, is that it will do things like that, which I just don't like. So backlight compensation, it will attempt to open up something in the foreground despite how bright it is in the background. So if you're running on full auto towards a window with some sun coming through it, it may well try to increase the light instead of using what's in the foreground to determine how the camera is set. It's going to use what's in the background. So it's going to take a bit more of an interest in what's going on behind you rather than what's generally in the center of the image. Because, I'll just put my hand here, about where my hand is, when you do white balancing, oh, sorry, camera's there, derp. When you do white balancing, when you do any sort of focusing or any automatic settings, the camera will generally use an area around the center of the sensor in order to determine what's going on. Okay, so about where my hand is where you want the white to be, where you want your subject to be, because that was how it will determine in full auto mode what to do. So if you had something bright over here that's up in this top corner, it may not even notice that. It may just go, well, I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to focus what's on the center. But if that light moved down to the center, the iris would close, the shutter speed would go up, and the gain would go down in order to compensate for that. Now, stabilizer. This is not something I don't think you'll need, forgive me, unless you're in an environment, say, maybe a boat. If you're using these on a boat, or if you're using it on a train, something that's got a lot of vibration at the floor, you may need stabilizer. BirdDog don't recommend using it unless you have to, and the reason for that is that it adds more processing time to all of this, to how the camera works. So I would stay away from that. And the last setting, unless you have to, I would stay away from that unless you absolutely have to use it. The last thing I want to show you on this page is gamma. This is something that's again from the large sensor camera world. So when you enable the gamma, it does something quite cool here where it actually gives a much more stylized look, but generally gammas like this are reserved for when you're using something called wide dynamic range. So if you use these two in tandem, you know, with a bit of tweaking, you get a lot more interesting image, which will automatically have quite a, from what I can gather from that gamma setting before. In fact, oh God, that looks ugly. God, why would I do that? The keyboard iris setting is not right. I'm not enjoying that. I would use these two in conjunction, wide dynamic range and gamma, although as you can see, it is quite noisy, but then again, so is my gain. So effectively, I have to tweak my image now again in order to deal with this. So take that down a bit. But you'd see, as I drop the iris, oh, isn't that looking quite ugly? Yeah, so this gamma mode, I can instantly say I'm not a fan of. And I would actually like an explanation from someone at BirdDog exactly what this gamma and wide dynamic range settings are for, or if it's something for the future, something they want to play with, and you know, later on, I don't know. But obviously, the first thing I would say if you're using this gamma mode is you're going to need a lot more light, because I've got a lot of light on me right now. I've got the iris fully open, and it's still not enough. So get more lights if this is if it's the look you like. So picture 2, oop, that is wrong. Let's get out of there. Picture 2, let's turn off the camera. Right, so that is our pleasing image. So if we head over back to our factory default, which is there, I'm going to try and get the other camera in a similar sort of angle. Zoom that out, like so, a bit more that way. Right, so there is camera 1 with factory default settings. There is camera 2 with what I think are slightly acceptable settings, and here's camera 3 that I tweaked properly before I did this, and I think looks the best of the 3. So me personally, when you tweak the cameras, you can get a lot more interesting image, particularly with the white balance. It's one of the most important things, and if you learn to white balance manually, your images are going to be much, much better, I promise you. So thank you very much. This will be the end. I've gone through all of the major picture settings and what I think, generally is the best settings for these sorts of cameras. So key lessons are: stay away from automatic modes. Whilst they're very smart, they generally suck and are dumb, because they will just take the first thing that comes their way and change accordingly. Learn to do everything manually if you can. That includes focus, that includes iris, that includes gain, that includes white balance. Do it manually, learn it, and then you'll have far better images. Whatever you do, it'll look far more professional. And the last thing I dare say is experiment. Have a play with the settings yourself. Do whatever you want. I mean, these are your cameras, so have a play if you've got the time. But if you want it to just work and work right, go back and look at the automatic settings that I suggested, and then you'll be able to just plug them in and off you go. Thank you very much for joining me. My name's been Nick from a company called Newsworthy Vision. I'll speak to you again soon.